The Quran's miracle in the face of a flood. A story witnessed by the world. Dear brothers and sisters, there are moments in history that leave a permanent mark upon the hearts of those who witness them. One such astonishing moment took place recently, and it has left millions across the globe overwhelmed with awe. In the midst of a violent flood that threatened to swallow entire villages, a single man stood firm holding the Book of Allah in his hands. What unfolded in front of those who were present has been recorded and shared worldwide, and people are still struggling to comprehend the power of what they saw. A flood had struck Pakistan with such ferocity that entire towns were devastated within hours. Rushing torrents of water burst through villages, fields, and streets, carrying with them not only debris but also the hopes and livelihoods of countless families. Homes that had taken years to build were washed away in minutes, crops that promised food for the season were destroyed, and roads that connected towns were broken apart like fragile toys. The disaster was so immense that those who experienced it referred to it as nothing less than a mini doomsday. But within this chaos, amid the fear and despair, a miracle unfolded that restored faith in hearts and reminded the believers that Allah never abandons His servants. It began when the roaring torrent, descending from the mountains, approached one of the villages with frightening speed. The water was not alone. Massive rocks, mudslides, and broken trees rolled within it, as though the mountains themselves had melted and were cascading toward the earth. Experts later testified that such was the momentum of the flood that if it had continued unhindered, it could have traveled the distance from Lahore to Islamabad within a mere 2 hours. That was the magnitude of its speed and terror. As the villagers watched, fear gripped their hearts. Faces turned pale, eyes widened in terror, and lips quivered with only one question. What will become of us now? Death seemed imminent, rushing toward them in the form of an unstoppable wave. Families clutched each other, children cried out, and elders whispered prayers, waiting for the end. But among this sea of frightened faces, one man stood out. He did not run, nor did he hide. Instead, he stepped forward, raising high in his hands the Holy Qur'an. With the calmness of someone whose heart is anchored in absolute faith, he opened the book and turned its blessed pages toward the raging torrent. And then, in a voice that carried both strength and serenity, he began to recite. The verses of Allah flowed from his tongue, their rhythm echoing against the chaos of the storm. His voice grew louder, firmer, unwavering, as though he were confronting not just water but the very forces of nature. The villagers, astonished, began to quiet down. Slowly, many of them joined in, their trembling voices uniting with his, reciting words that had been revealed 14 centuries earlier but carried the same timeless power. And then the unthinkable happened. That furious flood, which only moments earlier had been charging toward the village with unstoppable force, began to slow down. Its speed dropped drastically, from an estimated 120 kilometers per hour to a sluggish crawl. The waves that had seemed ready to crush everything in their path suddenly hesitated, as though struck by an invisible wall. Witnesses could hardly believe their eyes. They gasped, shouted, and cried, as they realized that the flood was no longer advancing toward them. Instead, in a phenomenon that defied explanation, the water turned away, flowing in another direction. The village was spared. What could have been their destruction became a scene of salvation. And on every tongue rose the same words. Allahu Akbar. They declared that Allah had sent His help, that unseen forces had descended to protect them, that the Quran itself had been their shield. This moment was more than just a rescue. It was a revival of faith. Those who saw it firsthand felt their hearts tremble with both fear and gratitude. They knew without a shadow of doubt that Allah is near, that in times of calamity His mercy envelopes His servants, and that His words are more powerful than any natural force. The video of this event spread quickly across social media platforms. Millions watched, replayed, and shared it, stunned by the raw display of divine intervention. Non-Muslims too were shaken, questioning how mere recitation could halt a raging flood. Believers, on the other hand, saw it as a living testimony that the Quran is not just ink on paper, but the speech of the Almighty, carrying within it strength beyond human comprehension. Dear viewers, this was not the only incident that left people in awe. Across the seas, in a distant village in Indonesia, another extraordinary miracle unfolded. One that once again reminded humanity of the unmatched power of Allah's words. In this Indonesian village, the people awoke one day to a storm unlike any they had ever experienced. The skies darkened with oppressive clouds, lightning cracked across the heavens, and winds howled with a fury that tore through everything in their path. It was as though the day of judgment itself had arrived. Entire trees, deeply rooted in the soil for decades, were ripped from the earth and flung aside like mere twigs. Roofs of homes were lifted and carried away, scattering through the air as if they were made of paper. The screams of families echoed as they watched their homes, their belongings, and their lives being torn apart by the merciless storm. In desperation, people of every faith turned to their gods. Idol worshippers rushed to their temples, bowing before statues and carved figures. Others clasped their hands together, calling upon deities who could neither see nor hear them. Their cries filled the air, but their pleas brought no relief. The storm raged on, unmoved by their desperate supplications. It was at this moment that the Muslims of the village made their choice. They knew that no stone, no statue, no powerless figure could save them. Their hearts knew only one truth. Salvation could come only from Allah, the Lord of all creation. Among them, one believer, his heart glowing with conviction, stepped forward. Placing his fingers in his ears, he raised his voice and called out the adhan, the call to prayer. Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar! His words rose above the storm. His voice, though human, carried the weight of divine truth, and it pierced through the chaos of wind and thunder. The adhan echoed through the village, reaching every ear, stirring every heart. Then came the miracle. Almost instantly, the storm began to weaken. Winds that had moments earlier carried the strength to uproot trees slowed to a calm breeze. The dark, terrifying clouds that had cloaked the sky began to disperse, and light pierced through once more. The dust settled, the roar of destruction faded, and peace descended upon the village. The people could hardly believe their eyes. Those who moments earlier had been bowing before idols stood frozen, unable to explain what they had just witnessed. Their gods had been silent, powerless to stop the devastation. Yet when the words of the adhan rang out, the storm itself obeyed, surrendering to the call of Allah's greatness. This scene was recorded and shared widely, eventually going viral across the globe. Millions watched the footage, many of them non-Muslims, and were stunned into silence. Some admitted openly that Islam was the true religion. Others, moved to tears, embraced Islam themselves. Even those who did not convert could not deny what they had seen. That the words of the adhan carried a power no human force could replicate. This miracle was a reminder that the adhan is not merely a routine call to prayer that punctuates the day of Muslims 5 times. It is a declaration of faith, a proclamation that Allah is the greatest, a shield against Satan, and a channel through which divine mercy descends upon the earth. If the adhan of one man could calm a raging storm, then what could happen if the entire Muslim Ummah raised its voice in unison, sincerely calling upon Allah? Surely, no enemy, no calamity, no force on earth could defeat them. Dear brothers and sisters, these events teach us lessons that should never be forgotten. They remind us that human strength is fragile, that science has limits, and that in times of calamity, the only true refuge is Allah. They teach us that the Qur'an is not just a book to be placed on shelves but a living miracle that can protect, guide, and save. They teach us that the adhan is not just a ritual but a mighty proclamation that shakes the heavens and earth. So let us never forget these signs. Let us hold firmly to the rope of Allah, trust in His power, and turn to Him in every moment of need. And let us end with a prayer. O Allah, Lord of the worlds, strengthen the faith of Muslims everywhere. Protect us from calamities and trials. Grant relief to those suffering from floods, storms, and disasters. Keep our children and future generations steadfast upon Islam. And accept our supplications, for You are the most merciful, the all-powerful. Ameen.